had built up collections over years. Not necessarily collecting them, but I have so many that I'm pulling out the first editions because they're more valuable.
Oh, okay. All right. So Doovid's here. Charles Moscowitz. Thanks for joining us. Doovid and I have been doing this thing every Thursday. Partners in Torah, right, Doovid?
Yeah, I mean, I did Partners in Torah for a while, and I think that's somewhat comparable. I mean, you're doing conservative news broadcasting, and I'm in streaming, but yeah, I think that's what keeps it going. Like, just like a weekly, we're going to get together and talk, Jewish issues from at least our best ability of Torah perspective, and it's kept us going for a good few months here in Metro Detroit. I think Partners in Torah is a popular program. They might even have like official organizations all across the U.S. The local yeshiva here, there's people that have been doing Partners in Torah for decades. Just like they call 1 hour a week and study some Torah, and it's literally countless people have been doing it for decades.
Oh, yeah. Well, we don't exactly study Torah here, but we do discuss Jewish issues and as they intersect with American politics and Israel. And obviously today, Dooovid, the big story is that Israel is under a full-scale, it seems to be a full-scale invasion. I mean, I look at the map and I see hundreds of locations where missiles are hitting all throughout Israel, from Beersheba right up to north of Tel Aviv and on into Jerusalem. And, all I can say is that, I honestly don't think, based on my own casual observations, that this would be happening right now had Donald Trump not been deposed from office. I don't want to get into details about that because we're back on YouTube and I want to stay back on YouTube. But let's suffice to say that if there had been some real leadership in Washington right now, not only would Israel not be having to undergo a full-scale invasion, but you wouldn't have Russia massing troops on the border of Ukraine and driving the US Navy out of the Black Sea. You wouldn't have people coming out of Taiwan saying that they're convinced that China might invade as soon as this summer. You wouldn't have Iran acting aggressively, moving armaments into Yemen. Lebanon is imploding. France is on the verge of civil war. In other words, if we had actual leadership in Washington, like we should, and like we would have had the situation been a little bit more normal, this wouldn't be happening, I would suggest. Of course, we can't know that because you can't know, about something you can project, but you can't know. But I think if we did some logic on this, we would come to that conclusion. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you, but probably for so to say, the wrong reason is because, and it's the main reason probably why Donald Trump, President Trump, was forced out of office, was because he probably wanted to do to American citizens what Israel is doing right now to protesters when Black Lives Matters and the protests first started, and President Trump, basically wanted to call in the army, and was stopped. And we talk more about that. But
that's an insurrection. They should have called out the army before those shock troops started looting Black businesses, burning Black neighborhoods, killing Black children all across the country. He should have called out the army for the same reason that if the Ku Klux Klan had done this. And I would suggest that the Antifa BLM people are not a lot better than the Klan. In fact, in many ways, they're worse in terms of the actual destruction they've done to the Black neighborhood. So yes, it's an insurrection, and they should have called out the National Guard.
Well, I mean, I don't prescribe shoulds, generally just analysis, but, saying like, yes, I mean, large reason this is happening is because Trump is not in office.
That's right.
And a large reason that, I mean, because Israel right now, so to say, like, if you could take a hardline position, like, just straight up, God forbid, you kill one of us, we're going to kill 100 of you. We don't care if it's just or moral or some sort of system. That's just the way it's going to be.
Israel does not engage in killing innocent people. Israel is dealing with a military situation.
Well, I mean, that's the Hasbara that they tell to Americans.
They stop people who are trying to kill them.
Well, I'm saying that's the Hasbara to say, does it matter who's just? and to say
Yes,
like,
it
well,
does matter
I
who's
don't care
judge.
who matters, who's,
Israel's judge.
God's going to decide who's right and who's
So
wrong.
people decide based on what they understand.
Yeah,
God,
but it doesn't
God
matter
made.
what people decide. It doesn't
Yes,
matter
it
what
does
people
matter what
think.
people decide.
Well, I'm
And
saying
people can
because you think of
decide for
violence.
anarchy, or they can decide for peace through strength. And if Israel engages in a policy of peace through strength, and they have the backing of well-meaning and well-regarding nations like the United States and the Western democracies, who also are operating as sovereign nations through peace through strength, then there would be order instead of what there is now, which is you have terrorists taking advantage of weakness. They know there's no leadership. Do you know that Biden, they can't even mention the word Hamas. They will not condemn it. Instead, they're doing the same crap they used to do years ago. Oh, we're having discussions.
Well, it's like
We're
stop and frisk. I mean, we mentioned these
This is
things,
bull crap.
and to say that you say like, yes, like returning to stop and frisk, totalitarian measures works for crime, and
Well,
supporting
that's up to
totalitarian
local
measures
police.
does limit crime.
That's
Is it-
totalitarian. It's up to local police agencies under the auspices of their governments to decide the means to keep people safe so that particularly Black people aren't being shot in crossfires when you have drug gangs. So yeah, that's up to local people. That's not totalitarian. That's stopping totalitarianism.
Well, I'm saying that you could allow people to let their karma play out without having a system interfering and just saying, I would
That's
prefer
what
to
we
take
have
my
right now.
life
We're
into
letting
my
the
own
karma
hands.
play out
And I don't
by
know if you saw the
basically
news in
doing
Detroit.
nothing. And the Democratic Party, by the way, is not doing anything, nor is Biden to the extent that he's able to do anything, because we don't even know if there's a screw loose. But putting that aside, they're not doing anything because they're under the control of the Jew-hating radical Dems like Rashida Tlaib and Omar and Ayanna Pressley and others who are supportive of Hamas. So they do nothing. That wouldn't have happened under Trump.
Well, yeah, it's under Trump, they probably would have,
It wouldn't have happened because they understood.
reality is
consequences.
we're going to see that it doesn't matter. Likely is
It
Israel
does
going
matter.
to clamp down with an iron fist, and it's not going to matter that if even if Biden and the Congress, stops giving aid to Israel, even if 90% of American Jews denounce Israel and support BDS, it's pretty likely that Israel's going to take a harsh right-wing
Right.
turn. And if
That's what
Netanyahu
we're doing.
isn't prime minister, first, to recognize that even
First of all,
the
in
left,
Israel,
even
it's
the
not-
left
it's
in
not
Israel
right.
agrees
Yes,
with
you're right.
Charles. Everybody on the
That's
left,
right, because they
even
want to say
labor Zionism, from what I
lives.
understand, even labor Zionism wants to
course
go
they do.
in
In fact,
and
they're stronger. They want to save the lives of themselves.
well,
and
I mean, that's
families.
Hezbollah. I mean, how you want to frame what's going on doesn't
Yeah,
really
it's
matter.
a war of aggression.
But I say it doesn't
by
matter. I'm saying for a
imperial
factual
forces
element, who
bombing
is right and who's wrong,
It just is.
and how you're moralizing doesn't really matter to the facts on
It's
the
what's
ground.
happening. The facts on the ground is that Israel is being invaded by.
It doesn't matter. I'm saying if two people are fighting,
Did Israel invade?
it doesn't
Gaza?
matter who's right and who's wrong.
Did Israel invade?
What led up to it? You just have the mechanics of a fight.
That's right, and it wouldn't have happened if. And in Israel,
Doesn't,
right.
at that
Left
point,
and
it
right,
doesn't
they're gonna
matter.
defend their property. They're going to defend their lives against an enemy that seeks to exterminate them. And that includes the left.
You have two
Includes
parties that are
communism.
fighting. It's largely an ethnic conflict. At this point, it's largely been
A
reduced
national
to an
conflict.
ethnic.
Israel's a sovereign state, and they have
But
missiles.
it's ethnic. I'm saying there's two sides, and they're
Israel's an
different
ethno-sovereign
peoples.
state.
They're different.
And
They're
you've got
different
missiles
ethnicities. They're
flying
different
in from a
races.
foreign force, that being Gaza, which is under the full control of Arab forces. And they've decided that rather than live in peace with Israel and create what could have been like a French Riviera on the beachfront, they wanted to engage in aggressive war against the state of Israel, and they're firing thousands of missiles. That's what's going on. It's a national problem.
Yeah, I guess I'll let people make up their own minds. I'm not prescribing
I think
how people
smart
should
enough to
interpret
see
or good
what's
and
going
bad. Like God's going to determine. Like I want to be
I
good.
do say what's good and bad.
Yeah, but saying to me
Aggression against the
that's
sovereign
preposterous
nation
and
is
ridiculous.
bad.
Like who cares what this man
I
thinks is
do
good or
care.
bad?
I
I mean, you
do
might care. There might be people who care what you think.
If we
and
don't have
that's
a
fine.
system by
But I mean,
which
from my
nations-
system of understanding, even of Torah, it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter. Like
it does matter
it's
what you
even
think,
worthless to have
and
an
it matters
opinion
what
on
you
it.
say. It means everything to have opinions. We are individuals. We're conscious. God gave us the ability to reason. He gave us the ability.
Well, I was saying you're even like someone.
engage in
If you're a
communication.
soldier, you got to fulfill your duty, whether you think it's good or bad. and you're not even necessarily supposed to think about it.
No,
So
you
like
don't.
whether you're the
If
good
you're
guy or
involved,
the bad
what if
guy,
you're,
if you're
if you're
Hamas
involved
right
in
now or
a
you're
situation
IDF
which
right
you didn't
now,
fit your
if you're a
conscience, you don't
soldier, you have to
fulfill it.
fulfill your dharma as a soldier, whether
No, you
you're the
don't.
good guy or the bad guy.
No, you don't. If you were a soldier being asked to exterminate people in a concentration camp, you don't have to fulfill it. You can desert. You can leave. There are people have conscience. So Israel is fighting a war of defense against a foreign aggressor, and every nation on earth, just like you as an individual and I, have a right to fend off a foreign aggression. That's why we lock our doors at night. That's why we lock the door of our car. We don't want to have an aggressor come in and take advantage and seize our property and threaten us. This is a natural thing to humanity. It's as natural to the animal kingdom.
Well, we talked last week about the man in Westchester who threw rocks at multiple synagogues, and now he's out on the street. And you're saying because he's your neighbor, we're not going to put this guy in prison even though he threw rocks at your synagogue because he's your neighbor. You got to figure a way how to get along. And we're not just going to.
Throws a rock at the synagogue, that's a crime, and you bring him up on charges, and you.
Well, there's the case in New York, and the judge decided to at least let him out until the case is brought, and obviously the guy has tens of cases against him in the past. He's still in the street. You're saying this is democracy at action in America. Just like I sent you that article on a tablet about Jamal Bowman, the representative who represents Westchester in that area. And he is drawing a parallel, which I've mentioned many times, is making this into a black-white conflict, because one of the most obvious things that anybody who looks at the Israeli-Palestine conflict will notice that the Jews generally are a lighter people than the Arabs. Well, you could say it nothing to, but it's like any observer from the outside is going to obviously notice that. How could you not notice that?
I don't care. It's irrelevant what people look like. What's important is how they act.
We're saying that
if they're acting aggressive, I don't give a damn what they look like. They're violating the law, and they should be brought to justice.
Okay, but saying you lost that battle. You lost that battle in Westchester. And you might win that. I'm saying you're going to win that battle in Israel. The politics in Israel, yes.
Lost
Netanyahu, even the left in Israel agrees with Charles. Like Charles is not even on the right. In Israel, Charles' opinion would be on the left. He like in Israel, Charles would be on the left, not the right, with opinions like he's saying.
And by the way, is this guy in Westchester a danger to people? I mean, is he threatening to throw more rocks at people?
Well, I don't know the case, but I'm saying it's all over. It's one of the biggest issues in the Jewish community in New York is that this man was released after.
Let due process take its course. I don't know whether he should or shouldn't have been released. If he's not an immediate threat to people, and there is going to be a process, and he's going to be charged, and there will be a trial, and the evidence will be presented, and then we'll see whether he's convicted. I don't know if it's necessary that he be held in prison all that time if he's not a threat. And that's something that judges and probably social workers, they need to evaluate that.
Well, we talked about that last week, and you were mentioning about, black on Jewish violence last week I was saying is a bigger concern of black on Jewish violence in American cities than what's happening in Israel. But it turned out that what we talked about in Israel escalated to God forbid, it was worse than Black Lives Matters in America. What happened in Minnesota is and all the protest in America was basically smaller than what happened in Israel. You had I think 20 shops burned in Akko synagogues, and these were basically a racial ethnic conflict where you had Arabs and Jews, and it's basically like a civil war and Hamas, and like whatever your approach, just say like whatever Charles is saying, even the people on the left in Israel are saying, the people on the right are saying far more extreme things than most people watching this could even imagine.
You mean like as in they want to evict all the Arabs? I mean, is that what are they saying? And
I was saying, God forbid, I wouldn't be surprised if a right-wing government came in on the platform of expelling Arabs.
Right.
And saying that like even someone like Naftali Bennett could be pushed a little bit more to the right, not even that much, because he's already under a soft form of expulsion. We talked about that as paying people to leave.
Right.
within where Charles like that's not expulsion, but I said
No,
depending
it's
on who you
not. I
define
think
it,
it's not.
some people say paying people to leave is also expulsion.
It's
But could
not.
that become
If it's
like the
voluntary,
fears
it's
of
fine.
people that's okay, we were going to pay you to leave, but now that you've
Well,
resorted to
that's
this
wrong.
violence,
I
we're
don't
just
support.
going to expel you.
Yeah, I
And
don't
it's saying
support.
like, well, I
That's
was
not
saying it
the
doesn't matter that you
if
support
someone's
that. What if
law-abiding,
25% of Israelis support that?
well, look, ultimately that's up
What
to
if Israel does that and they say, I don't care what you, Charles, I don't care if
something.
Biden and everybody in the
If that's
American,
what the government of Israel wants to do, then that's their decision. People have to live there. They have to get to work. They have to get their families safe. They have to have their children safe when they go to school. If that's what they need to do, if they need to go to that kind of an extreme measure, then that's what they need to do. I don't support it. I don't think it should come to that. As far as people who are looting synagogues in Lod, as you talked about, and that those are serious crimes. They should be brought up on those crimes, and if they are convicted, they should be maybe certainly incarcerated and maybe expelled because they have violated the rights of people in Israel. It's a civil society.
yeah, so on your
But I
first
don't I
point
don't
is that's
support
what I think Trump
mass
felt about
deportation.
Americans. That what you just said is probably how Trump felt
And
about
yeah,
Black Lives
and
Matters protest in Americans.
yeah, I would agree with that. If these racist thugs are burning black businesses and shooting black people, then yeah, they should not be expelled, but they should be brought up, and we should have a due process. If they're charged and found guilty of those crimes, they should
As
pay
opposed to
price for those
LA, New
crimes.
York, and most major areas that basically said like no, like we're going to have extremely limited policing, and
Yeah, look what's happening
the
now.
people are going to be released. Even these people,
Sure.
even if they
Well,
aren't
that's a
caught,
bad idea.
we'll schedule them a
Now you have
trial for
police
a later
leaving.
date and release them in the meantime. And it's just kind of like a facts on the ground,
Yeah, now the facts on the ground are police are leaving the departments all over the country, especially in the big cities. People are not getting into policing because they're afraid that if they go out and they police and they deal with someone who might happen to be a minority, they could end up being put up on the front page of the newspapers and called names, and they have their lives destroyed. It's not worth it. So
but you
people
say
are not
just straight
going,
up, people are afraid
and so there's not
that they're
enough
going to
police
see
in
in
New York,
America
and
what
that's
they're
why you
seeing
can
in
have a guy
Israel.
show
People are
up in
afraid that
Times
what's
Square and
happening in
shoot
Israel
people.
right now is going to happen in America.
It can happen anywhere. If it can happen to you and I if we don't lock our doors.
Well,
There's
I mean, locking your door is not going to
right.
help, especially when people start using bombs and weapons. And saying in Israel, people
Well,
are kicking down doors. Like God forbid, there's lynching, the violence on the street. There's been over 400 Arabs arrested. There's been hundreds of injuries. There's been a few deaths.
and
And
Israel should operate in a
it's
manner that
somewhat on both
defends the
sides.
lives
There's
of
there's
their
wandering
people.
bands of Jews beating up Arabs. It's not just
Well, they
Arabs.
shouldn't be doing that either. But the point is that Israel has to act as any normal, sane, sovereign state would act, which is to defend the lives and the property of its people.
So what that means now is they're calling up people for service, that all those people who had been enrolled in mandatory military service, or those people who had finished their service are going to be called on
Fine.
what they signed up for, and they're going to go to war. They're going to be
That's
thousands
right.
of them,
If
and they're
God
going to have to
forbid
go
my
to
country
Gaza,
goes with it.
and they're going to have to fight these
They
people.
very well might. We
And
don't
if
know
they
that.
don't,
That's not our
Israel will force them to, or Israel will throw them in
Sure,
prison.
it's a war. I mean, either that or Israel is going to cease to exist. I mean, look, it's an existential war. I'm not going to even comment on that. That's not my business. That's the Israelis' business. That's, if Massachusetts was being invaded, that I'd comment. But if that's what Israel and the government there and the military there feels is necessary, then they have to do what's necessary to stop the killing, to stop the missiles and the terror tunnels and the gas balloons. They have a
So
right,
generally,
as any sovereign nation, to defend the lives and property of its citizens. If they can't do that, and if they don't do that, then they don't deserve to exist.
well, so you also, what's the likelihood that there's a regional war, and what's the likelihood that Israel, uh, how is Israel, stand? Saying what happens if Syria and Lebanon join, and what happens if Iran,
Exactly.
and like what does the Bible say, Charles? You know what the Bible says. The Bible says that all of the nations of the the north or the south or the east and the west are going to be fighting each other,
Yeah, so we'll have
And
world
then
war.
they're going to
All the
all
more reason.
change their mind. I mean, it's the prophecies
Yeah,
in various places, and then they're
it's
going to
not
change
just
their
the book
mind
of.
and all turn against Israel. So, I mean, it's the
All right,
basic
fine.
picture that our ancestors, the Hebrew prophets, painted out, that at the end of days, it's going to look like there's going to be a great war between East and West. But as Daniel says, the king of the north and the king of the south eat at the same table, and they're going to say, "Why are we bothering waging war for each other? Let's just team up with each other and wage war against Israel." And then miraculously, God and the true Jewish people are going to win. So if you're Satmar right now, the basic prophecy is yes, the whole world's going to turn against Israel right now, and the false Israel, the false Israel, if it's Zionism or whatever your picture is, if it's the Jews, if it's the church, will fall, and miraculously the true Jews will
Well, look,
survive.
I'm not
And,
going to comment
and
on
I'm saying
Bible
there's so
prophecy.
many different versions
That's up to God. I mean,
of
people
but I'm saying
can
that is
interpret
what
it
our
in ways.
ancestors prophesied, that all the nations would turn against
Yeah.
us.
And the best way
So
to
you do
stop
agree
that.
that that's generally what the
Yeah,
Bible
that is
says.
generally Book of Daniel, Book of Joel.
I mean, it
In
makes
the,
sense that
in the
you
New
say like
Testament,
that
you have the Book
America,
of Revelation.
Germany, Britain, Iran, all countries are in fact going to turn against us. That's what the
Yeah,
prophet said.
that you're right. I mean, that there's prophecies of that. Book of New Testament talks about it in the Book of Revelations. That's the end times. Look, I mean, I don't really, I'm not in a position to even question or analyze prophecy. I'm suspicious of people, frankly, who think that they have that kind of authority because it's really the word of God. It's
Let's start over the
beyond.
temple. I mean, really, where did this battle start over? It
Well,
started
yeah,
over the
it
Jews
started
saying
over the
the
temple.
temple is ours. We are
But
going to
but look, the
have the
point is
police,
that the
that
way
the Arabs said, Hamas said, if you don't remove your police from the Temple Mount, we are going to start firing missiles. And the Jews said, it was on the day of Jerusalem, the temple is ours. We are going to have our police station there. And Hamas followed through and started firing rockets. So from
all
some
right, well, look,
respects, it is about the Bible. It is about the temple. And this was as
Dooovid,
clear
if
as
that be the
possible. This
case,
started over the temple. This
yeah,
conflict
okay,
unquestionably
probably did.
it started. And so if you're a Jew, are you saying, let's do it? The temple is ours,
No, I'm
and
saying
I'm
that
willing to go to war
that
for
is
it. I
no,
don't care if there's
I'm not willing
Muslims
to
in a
go to
mosque
war for
that
that.
don't want their mosque there. We're going to
No.
build our temple there,
Yeah, first of all,
no matter how many lives it costs.
let's be
God
clear,
forbid.
but this is on YouTube, so I want to be clear right now. Nobody's going to be building any temples on the Temple Mount, okay?
Well, says you.
Likely says maybe the state
So
of
you're on their
Israel,
side, not
says
ours.
president, says the prime minister Netanyahu, says this, the majority, the 99% of the people of Israel. Yeah, there's a radical, tiny group of very zealous Jews who want to do this. They're
I'm not
not.
part of any of those groups. I'm just saying, as a believer,
It's
this thing.
not
Yeah,
going to
I do
happen.
think that I do. I think you're wrong. I do think the temple is going to be rebuilt,
Me
and not
too,
because
but
I'm
not
part of
now.
some radical organization or
It's
terrorist
look,
group,
ultimately,
because
yeah.
I'm a typical believing Jew that
So
said
am
my
I.
prayers this morning.
Look, I believe it will be rebuilt too, and I pray for the day when it will be rebuilt. I don't think it's going to happen now, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. It's going to happen when the Jewish people reach a level of spirituality and when they know God and that the world knows God, that we are ready to have that happen, I believe. And I think there's a lot of commentary that would go to that. But
So we
I
caused it.
want to talk
We were
about what's
wrong.
happening
It's
now
like
on the
we caused
ground.
this by forcing our police on the temple. If we
No,
had
that's
said to the Muslims, "You're right, we don't belong here, and you could have the temple. We're not going to put our riot police on your Temple Mount," this whole thing wouldn't have happened.
I don't know if it would have or not. I think it wouldn't have happened if Donald Trump was in office, is what I think.
Well, I'm saying
And
Donald Trump was in office, we probably could have taken the temple
no,
and
the temple would have been
and
continued.
rebuilt it, and no one
It
could have
would have
done
been
anything about
no,
it.
they
Just
wouldn't
like
have
in the time
rebuilt the
of
temple.
Cyrus in
No
Persia,
one's
we rebuilt our
rebuilding
temple,
a
and because
temple
we
right
had the
now.
help of the king of Persia, no one else
No,
could have
yeah,
done
but right
anything
now,
about it.
no one in Israel has the will or the interest, other than a small fringe of people, to rebuild the temple. What would happen is that the Temple Mount would have continued in its status quo, which is shared, mainly ministered by Muslims, with some Jewish oversight, and that the Israel would operate from a position of strength because they knew they had the forward-thinking Christian Western democracies allied with them, and not this kind of internationalist cabal that has taken over in Washington, which doesn't give a damn about Israel, nor do they believe in anything. They just want to have physical world order. And so Israel's willing, they're going to sacrifice Israel. Now, as far as the end times when all the nations turn against Israel, that's God's mind. I don't know that. You don't know it ultimately. Nobody does. But we can deal with what we do know. We can deal with the facts, as the Israelis like to say, on the ground. And that is that we can have peace through strength. Ultimately, we can't determine what God has in mind. But right
Yeah, but
now,
we
we
know it's
can
about the
determine
temple.
our
We know
own future
100,000
as
Arabs,
sovereign people.
100,000 Arabs prayed on the Temple Mount today. And we know that that's the site
And,
where we
and I
want. And
bet they
so,
were
what's
they
the
praying
purpose
for
of
peace?
having Israel if we can't take our most holy site? And it's like India, where we're having the biggest support right now in Israel from India, because they look at it the same way. Is there's mosques all over India on the sites that there were former Hindu temples, and
I
they
don't
want to
think
remove
Israel's
those
ready,
mosques
Dooovid,
and
to
put up
take
Hindu
over the town.
temples where there were Hindu temples before, and say, yes,
Yeah,
that's exactly
and it's a
what Jews,
flashpoint.
what we want to do.
It's
And
a
if Israel
flashpoint.
is strong, what Israel, I mean, it really is going to be about the temple, that Israel has to
You
say,
know
we're
something,
taking the
Dooovid?
temple,
I think I
and we
talked
don't
about
care
this
what the
last
world
week.
or anyone says,
You're
or it's
right,
just
but
going to.
I think we talked about this last week as well. And first of all, I don't think that I agree with Prime Minister David Ben Gurion and the Moshe Dayan and the others who were running the government in 1967 when Israel liberated Jerusalem. And that is that they ensured the fact that the Muslim Waqf would continue to administer the Temple Mount, with Jews able to go up there. I went up there. You probably went up there. And yet,
No, I didn't go up there because my rabbi said it's
okay, well,
forbidden.
I
And
did go there.
I'm not, that
I went. Anyways, the
I went to
point,
the Kotel over a
and,
hundred
and by the
times,
way, it
but
was a very uncomfortable experience, I must say, but it was another story. Either way, that was the status quo after 1967. The state of Israel, the Jewish people spiritually, the Jewish people in the terms of physically, are not in a position right now to start taking over the Temple Mount and rebuilding the temple. It's just not likely right now. Maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000 years, but not now. Now, ultimately, and I think I mentioned this last week, when Israel is ready to rebuild the temple, because they've reached that level of both temporal and spiritual strength, they will have to do it. And this is my reading. I'll admit, I'm not a biblical scholar. I look at these things in a very Peshat way. But my understanding is that they will and they should conduct the rebuilding of the temple as a joint venture with Muslims, not solely as a Jewish venture. And that is because that is how King Solomon did it when he built the first temple.
that's
He
what
went,
Claire Caw just said right here on YouTube in the chat. The third temple should not be built because Al-Aqsa is there for a reason, to remind Jews that Judaism has been superseded by Islam. That your religion is false because our most holy site right now is in ruins and there's a glorious mosque right on the site. What bigger proof do you need than that your religion is false? So saying that, like, no, I mean, just put it straight up.
how
It
about the
is
fact
about
that
the
we have a
temple.
state there and we ultimately do control it? I mean, we could rebuild it tomorrow if we wanted to.
Well,
The
could you?
Israeli army
You're
could
saying
go.
no, you couldn't because they
We
would go to war,
we
because
should have.
Hamas would fire rockets. The reason you can't build the temple tomorrow is because you're scared.
No,
You're
we should
scared
not.
of
It's
war.
not
You're
because I'm
scared the
scared.
Muslims and
We
the Arab
shouldn't
are
build
going to
it
go to
because,
war against us if we
Donovan,
do,
I'm saying we shouldn't build it because we're not
because
ready
you're
to build it.
scared.
No, we could because we're just not ready
Because
spiritually.
you're scared.
We're not scared. And
You're
as I
scared
said,
of the Muslims and the Arabs.
and as I was saying, it should be done as a joint venture with Muslims, just like King Solomon did it as a joint venture with Hiram of Tyre, who was not he was a Philistine, he was a Canaanite leader of the Phoenicians. It was a joint venture. You had Jews and Phoenicians coming together and building the temple. So if there's going to be a temple, they should develop some kind of a Sanhedrin or some kind of a council that is made up 50% of Jews and 50% of Muslims. And they should get together and start to talk about this maybe for the next 100 years and figure out the logistics of when and how it should be done. It should not be a solely Jewish adventure. It should be a Jewish Muslim venture, I should say. And it's not a matter of being scared, it's a matter of doing the right thing. For Jews to simply march in and rebuild the temple alone, I do think that's an overstep. I don't think that's what God has in mind. I think that history has shown that that's not how it was done. So you know, if you look at the Book of Kings, it talks about this. Hiram Abiff, who was a great builder and who was, I think he was half Jewish and he was half
Danonite, half from the tribe of
he was
Dan.
half of Dan and half from Sidon. He was this great architect. I know that the Masons see him as the founder of Masonry. Whole different subject. We don't want to go into that. But the point is that the Book of Kings has him as a chief advisor to Solomon and basically conducting and organizing and engineering the building of the temple. The cedars came from Phoenicia, Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. It was a joint venture between these two kings, King Solomon and King Hiram. Well, the temple building, rebuilding should be likewise a joint venture between Jews and Arabs, however that would come about.
With all humanity, all nations.
In the name of all humanity, because once the temple is rebuilt, then you have the dawning, potentially, of the Messianic age. So, to my way of thinking, these are things that Israel is overstepping if they think they're going to go in, and that's why they don't do it. It's not because they're scared, but because it is an overreach. It's not the right thing to do.
David said, right now we're bombing Gaza. So I'm saying instead of bombing Gaza, what we should be doing is just taking the temple. You're saying we don't like the bombing Gaza doesn't help anything.
It does
saying,
help.
Like if we just took the temple now,
I can't figure out
would that accomplish a lot more than bombing Gaza? Or you think bombing Gaza is accomplishing something?
Because the thing I can't.
You think bombing Gaza is accomplishing something?
Let me just. It's stopping the missiles.
Well, it's obviously not stopping the missiles.
Well, how is it that Gaza? I mean, this is like a fascinating. I actually asked this of Mordechai Kadar, who is an Israeli politician on my show, and who knows something about security. How is it that Gaza, which is blockaded on the ocean from, ships smuggling weaponry in, they're blockaded on both the Israeli and Egyptian borders. How did they get all these missiles in there? This is not a big place. Gaza is tiny. It's probably about as big as, Boston.
I would say from Iran and their Arab brethren that support their struggle.
How did they get it past the Israelis? I mean, to me,
smuggling, incompetence, Jewish traders who help.
Well, that's the question. There's something that's not, if you don't mind my saying, kosher.
Well, I'm saying that with iron fist, that if Israel clamped down the ranks, we would be able to stop all smuggling. Like, no,
not all.
Just like drug smuggling.
Hundreds of missiles, thousands of missiles. How could that have all happened right under the nose of Israeli authority? I mean, the Israelis have one of the best armies in the world, and yet they have not been able to.
All governments are incompetent like that. I mean, police, they're saying like the U.S. border, the Canadian border. I'm saying that, Israel's a little bit better than, your average country, and especially in that. But it's like, no,
they have really
can't stop smuggling at the border.
Smuggling is one thing, but hundreds of these enormous missiles, somebody has screwed up big time in Israel. And I mean, I've asked.
No one screwed up. It's saying, that's the way you're looking at it and saying, like, yeah, you could crack heads and be like, how did they get past it? But that's what.
Well, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Israel has bombed Syria like 200 times.
Fine.
From my understanding, and almost all of those. Almost none of those were about missiles. Almost all of those were about preventing Iran from smuggling weapons to Palestinians. They're saying Israel doesn't really bomb like missile sites and things in Syria. Israel mostly bombs weapons smuggling from Iran to Gaza. So you're saying we know that. But even if you did percent, I'm not an Israeli. If you get an Israeli military expert on who knows this stuff, but if you say that Israel intercepts 95% of the weapons that are smuggled to Gaza, and you see the ADL numbers, that there are hundreds of millions of people around the world on the side of Palestine, and especially in the Arab world, where
how did they get missiles into Gaza? I mean, Israel
smuggle them, of course. All right. I'm not a criminal. I'm going to describe to you how criminals. They have tunnels. They have tunnels. They have boats. There's God forbid Israel prosecutes their own citizens occasionally for helping smuggle weapons to Palestinians. I mean,
Yeah,
like even if you follow Israeli news, every
maybe it's
once in a while there's
unavoidable,
a
but the
Jew
thing is
who
that
gets prosecuted for smuggling weapons from Iran to Gaza.
I see that as the problem. I mean, if Gaza wants to live peaceably alongside the state of Israel and focus on improving the lives of their own citizens and turning that country into what could have been, like the French Riviera. It's a beautiful
You say
area
it's
of
human
beachfront
nature to
property.
fight. It's saying
Instead
that
of
you say,
instead
oh,
of
we're going to
engaging,
beat you down so bad that you're not going to want to fight anymore.
well, it's
You
just
know that's
why
not
would they
true.
want
That
to? The point is that
people, even if they stand no chance, it's the human nature to want to die fighting. I mean, not like all
yeah,
humans, but a certain
if they're going to die fighting, then the people that they're fighting are going to respond in kind. And if they want to be peaceful, it would.
That's why we have war. I mean, that's why you get war. I
It's
mean, we
not
talk about
inevitable, though,
week in
Dooovid.
review last
It's
week.
not
I was
inevitable. It
talking
has to do with
the
leadership.
metaphysics of the
If the
escalation.
leadership in Gaza wanted to exist peaceably alongside Israel and develop the trappings of an independent Palestinian state, Israel would be more than happy to accept that and work with them. The problem is that they want to use Gaza as a launching pad to destroy Israel itself. And it's just it's a war. That's why I say it's a war of aggression. They don't want to have just peace
What
and
you're saying it's something abnormal from normal human nature. This is just
no, it is normal human
normal
nature,
human nature escalation of conflict.
but there's enough normal human nature also in Gaza. I mean, maybe I'm being anecdotal here, but I worked at a spice factory near the Gaza border many years ago, probably maybe 20 years ago now, for a summer. And in that factory, there were both Israelis and Arabs from Gaza who came in every day to take this job. And I befriended the Arabs more than the Israelis, even though I was warned to be careful about talking about too anything controversial. You know me, I'm interested, so I did talk with them. And my impression was that they admired Israel and they admired the accomplishments, but they wanted to have a sovereign Arab state in Gaza, and that they saw it as something that would coexist peaceably with Israel. And I think that would describe probably most Arabs in Gaza, at least at that point. But the problem is that their leadership was not interested in that. Their leadership wanted to have Gaza to attack Israel, to not have peace. So, sure, you're always going to have an element that wants war. But you also have a larger element of the people who don't and who would rather find a way to conduct affairs peacefully. And, I guess the question is which side prevails. That's why I'm a populist, because the populist politicians represent the people as opposed to the people like, frankly, those in government right now who are internationalists, who represent the elites. They represent the oligarchs. They don't care about average
I mean,
people.
populists,
They
when both
have
sides say we want to fight, when the
no
Palestinians and
populists.
the Jews both say I want to fight it out. And
No,
so if
they
you're a
don't.
populist leader among the
The
Jews, what
populists
we want
among
you to do is lead us to war. And if
no,
you're
they
a
don't.
populist leader among the Arabs, what they want you to do is
The
lead them to war.
populists in Israel and in the Arab countries don't want war. It is the leadership in the Arab country that wants to destroy Israel. And the Israelis are going to meet them, as any sovereign state would have to defend their country. Israel's not the aggressor. Israel is defending the lives and property of its people. The Palestinian Arabs of Gaza have chosen, or their leadership has chosen. I don't think the people have any say in it over there. Talk about authoritarianism.
But Israelis don't have any say in it either. I'm saying it's a mandatory.
The
If you're
Israelis
in
are
Israel right
defending
now
themselves.
and
They're
you get
fighting in
called up to
defense.
service, you do
Yeah,
not have any
because
say in
they
it.
have
You
to
got to
defend
go.
the country. They have to, and not all, by the way, but we'll put that aside. The point is that Israel,
But I'm
like
saying
any,
Israelis don't have any say in this either. If there's a campaign into Gaza, you don't have a choice in saying, I think
that's
it's the
right,
wrong thing to
because
go
they're
into
fighting a
Gaza.
war for
The government
survival.
will either throw you in
It is
prison
a
or make you
war of
do it.
defense. They're fighting a war of defense. And I want to get off this merry-go-round. I'll go one more time. If Gaza wanted peace to live alongside Israel, there wouldn't be a war and the Israelis would not be called up. But because they're firing thousands of missiles into Israeli cities and they're trying to kill as many Jews as possible, then yes, the citizens of Israel in this condition are being called up to defend their country. That is a fact of war. If there was a war in this country, we would be called up also. right? There was a draft in World War II. People were drafted in Vietnam. They were drafted, and that wasn't even a war of defense. I mean, that was
I
a
was making the
war of,
point that people, Israelis don't have any say in this matter either. If the government of Israel
oh,
decides
that's
to go to war,
of
it
course
doesn't
for them.
matter to Israelis. They don't
That's
have to
right.
go to
They
war.
don't have a say in it because it's a national security question. They're defending their lives. You know, in any more than in any nation, if they're under assault and they're under invasion, people get, you do lose a certain temporary amount of freedom. People get called up, people get dislocated because you have to deal with the exigencies of what's happening at that moment so that you can hopefully go back to the status quo ante after that enemy is stopped. Otherwise, nobody will have any say because if they take over, they're going to kill all the Jews.
We talked about this before, like a deterrence theory that say largely comes from Israel, like the military deterrence theory. But partners in Torah, I was mentioning Week in Review, even the last few weeks, Nachmanides in his commentary on Torah says that revenge is a spiritual taiva, a taiva ruchni, a pleasure from the spirit. And I think it's laid out in a way that like a mathematic physics, if you
Mm-hmm.
cause damage to another person, that other person, not just the physical damage, has like a blemish in their soul that could only be quenched by causing an equal or greater amount of damage to the person who damaged you. And that's how, Nachmanides, the Ramban, who debated popular Christianity, lays out, like a Kabbalistic metaphoric concept about the escalation of force, that there's some blemish on the person's soul of being damaged, that really could only, I mean, they're not to say the only method of quenching it, and it's not even a physical thing. That their argument that animals don't do revenge in the same way, that it's a unique element of the human soul. You've hurt my honor, and the
Mm-hmm.
only way for me to regain my honor is to cause an equal or greater amount of pain in the person who pained me. And that's the natural escalation. The Kabbalists use the terms thought, speech, action, that usually conflict first arises in thought, where a person just thinks badly about another person, and then to the level of speech before action. So all conflict goes through a process of thought, speech, to action. But once a person's been damaged, there's some permanent hole in the soul that the natural inclination, driving factor of the person is, I must create an equal amount or greater pain in the person who caused me this pain. And saying the Kabbalists say that that's why we have to be righteous people. And, even like the Christian concept, turn the other cheek, that there has to be a way to de-escalate this natural tendency. Because right now, Jews, Israelis, Arabs, they're all thinking the same thing. Pain was caused to us, and I have this blemish in my soul that will not be quenched until the people who caused this pain suffer back. And so there has to be some method to end the cycle, because the natural inclination is to escalate conflict and to try to cause more damage in the party that damaged you. And that's why anybody watching what happened here is uh, I mean, you could say the tinderbox, but it was basically a tit for tat, and it still is kind of a tit for tat with Israel, Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, Jewish radicals, and it kind of like tit for tat with one guy saying some things, one guy, a few guys getting beat up, to protests, to police actions, to war, and as now enough people have been killed that that whatever it is, if you're a Palestinian, if you're an Arab, or if you're a Jew right now, and someone is dead, you have a revenge thing that's not even just physical. It's an element of the soul that says the person who killed my brethren must pay with their life. And the Torah like lays out methods to try to deal with this. And even the Torah says like war is a natural outgrowth of conflict. And the difference between the American Jewish strategy and the Israeli strategy, as being a minority in a diverse nation, is going to produce a vastly different strategy than having a Jewish state. And even like right-wing Jews are saying that, like, I would not be surprised if as I said, that we will see an escalation of war. And even Netanyahu, if he gets replaced, it's more likely to be by a more nationalistic element. And even the voices on the left are basically taking a Jewish ethno approach to the conflict. And so we talked about this for like a one state solution and say, okay, like now, the lesson to be learned from this is to tear down the wall, and we're all going to create this utopia, happy place where we're going to live happily together. And saying Israel is like 0% such. In the U.S., I still think that, like, and maybe it's because I'm a minority. If I, like I said, like if I had blue eyes, maybe I'd think different. But as a minority, that's basically how I think and hope and look at America. But I see in Israel, and I even said this as a half Jew. I call myself a half Jew, and to say even as someone just who has a non-Jewish father, feel a little bit excluded in Israel. They're saying like Israel, like, maybe the right of return, like, I lived and studied in Israel, the state of Israel paid for my education. But like, yeah, like Israel was created, like most Israelis are 100% Jews. And I felt like, a little bit of an outsider to many expect as, someone who was, completely on the Jewish side. How would I feel if I was an Arab? And at this point, what's the likelihood that if you were an Arab that you say, I want to fight? And mention that because it's like the nakmani, because it's a blemish on the soul, the person doesn't fear the consequences. Saying that there's this
Right. Well,
tendency
first
to
of all,
say, I don't fear
anybody,
death, meaning saying this guy disgraced my honor, and I will fight even if I have a 0% chance of surviving because it's a
no, I
blemish
get,
on
I get the impulse, and anybody, by the way, can
well,
convert.
it's a nakmandi. So I'm just saying what I
I
learned in
understand
yeshiva. Like I learned this in yeshiva.
anybody can convert to Judaism. But putting that aside, you're right to note that in humanity, we have this idea of revenge, which makes one of the aspects that makes us unique from the animal kingdom. It is a product of human consciousness, of human reason, and that it's a very dangerous aspect of our personality because it can lead to these sort of cycles of violence and even war, God forbid. The point is that at the same time that we have that element, we also create systems of law and order, systems of nation states, which are based upon what John Adams so eloquently stated: nations based on laws and not men. In other words, we set up these structures of laws that are put in place to try to, and not perfectly, but try to impartially deal with these kinds of conflicts in a way that brings about some redress of grievance, even though you can't totally make the playing field even. So if you are damaged by someone else, if somebody murders your someone in your family, or you get ripped off or whatever it is, we set up systems of government that allow you to find an imperfect redress of the grievance, even though it's impossible to really do that, especially when human life is involved. And that we rely on those systems to do this. And as far as like nations going to war goes, wars are something that is a dark side of human nature. I don't think we're ever going to abolish war. And people who say that they think we can, that they're talking about an agenda that actually is against human nature. War is going to be with us until the Lord God, King of the universe, says otherwise.
Multiculturalism is possibly, you say, okay, if way of life at some point is zero sum, that it's basically it's
No,
a
but the
Jewish
point is that
nation,
as
we're
conscious
going to set it up
people,
like a white privilege, Jewish privilege for Jewish
I'll talk
people.
about that in a minute, Dooovid. But the problem,
Versus like
the
saying
issue
like a
is that
multicultural or an Arab nation makes it zero sum. That good people, not necessarily even bad people, good people, like Bhagavad Gita, Krishna, are the people might be at fault, but in essence, people just following their dharma and their duty have to go to war with each other. And saying,
no, they don't have to go to
I don't
war.
even dislike this guy. In another world, we would be friends, but just me and my duty
So
as
that,
my
look at
people have to
we're
go up to war against another
yeah.
person who's just doing a
Let me
duty
just
to his
finish my
people.
response. We don't have to go to war, and there are means and methodologies which reduce war and make it more like a neighborhood fight rather than having everybody pile on and create a world war over it. And there are ways and means to try to mitigate so that you can reduce war, but you can never totally eliminate war, just like you can never totally eliminate crime. People are going to take advantage of other people if they think they can get away with it, no matter what happens. And that includes even wars and using deception as a means to get nations into wars.
I mean, death
Now, as
has to
far
be
as
avenged. So
Israel
if you
being,
have tens of dead Arabs, there are hundreds of millions of Arabs, and it's saying like those deaths have to be avenged, and that's a natural inclination upon all people to want to avenge the death of their brethren.
by the way, I've got a good TikTok here. Someone's saying our government is funding Palestinians. Biden does not even want to talk to the leadership of Israel. I think that's so true because, as I say, the Democrats are in thrall of the Jew-hating members of Congress and others. And, this wouldn't be happening right now, I would argue, if Trump was continuing in his second term. Now, as far as
I think
Israel,
Biden's defending. I mean, you could say, but Biden is probably defending his Jewish kids, grandkids, and he sees also as they're
I
part
doubt it.
Jewish.
I
Well,
don't think,
but
assuming Biden even has two marbles bouncing around in
But I
his
mean, he
head,
wants to keep,
I
just
don't
like
think he's
Trump wanted to keep his Jewish grandkids safe. I'm assuming that Biden also wants to keep his Jewish grandkids
I
safe.
doubt if Biden
But
gives a damn about his
Jewish means to
grandchildren.
him, it probably means something. He
Yeah, I
understands
don't
Jewish.
think Biden cares because I don't know if Biden is mentally at this point capable of thinking about anything. But as far as Israel being an ethno-religious state, yes, it is. Judaism is an ethno-religion. Yes, it is a religion, and yes, people can become Jewish of all ethnic backgrounds and do. But there is also an ethnic element to it. There's no denying that.
The
It
Pew
just
survey came out this week. We talk
what?
about that in a later week, but yeah, I mean, we have the statistics basically of the makeup of Israel.
That's an issue. We could talk about that maybe next week. But the point I'm making here is that, yeah, Judaism is an ethno-religion. That's just the nature of it. That's what has helped us survive for the diaspora for 2,000 years. That is part of our belief that emanates from the Torah. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think it's a matter of trying to, as long as we're not imposing anything on other ethnic groups, which we're not. It's
We're
just the
imposing
nature of
our
who we
dominion
are.
of the land of Israel. That
Yeah, on that tiny
our
swath of
belief
land.
system carries
Yeah,
with it
that's right.
that
Israel is a Jewish state. You're absolutely right. Although non-Jews in Israel have, full functionality as citizens. I mean, maybe not as complete, but you could talk about theocracies throughout the world right now. Great Britain is a theocracy. It's an Anglican state. The Queen of England is also the head of the Anglican Church. So yeah, Israel is a Jewish state. And yes, it gives a little preference to the Jewish people. And that can include people who convert to Judaism. And that's just the nature of the state. Every sovereign state is different. Every sovereign state has its own culture, its own approach to the way of life of its citizens. And in the case of Israel, that culture is Jewish. That is the very reason and the very method and the very mission of the state of Israel. It is the homeland of the Jewish people. And
so
the
you
Jewish
agree that
people means both
Israel's likely to not
religiously
care
and
about America that much, like Biden or whatever we do, even if we cut the funding. I think it's likely the Congress is probably going to cut funding to Israel, whether you're right or wrong, or however it's narrated.
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean,
And
although I
but
think
I don't
that
think Israel. I don't think it's going to affect Israel that much. And the current power,
something, I don't know
structure
if
is.
that's
I
true,
think
brother,
America is
because
weaker
I
than
think
it.
that there are still some Democrats, like, for example, Charles Schumer, right, who still are supporters of Israel. I don't think that, certainly the Republicans, I assume, are all supporters of Israel. And I think that there are still a few Democrats in there who have not been taken over by this Jew-hating cabal, who are going to support Israel. I would mention Schumer as one of them, even though I may not agree with him on practically
We
anything.
mentioned last week as the Andrew Yang, Eric Adams, and I
Yeah, what's going on with
mentioned
that?
that Eric Adams, even though in the 90s he had first came to public recognition in the Nation of Islam, has been a longstanding friend working with the Jewish community, Brooklyn borough president for decade, and is very popular among the Haredi Hasidic Orthodox community in Brooklyn, versus Andrew Yang, that doesn't have a longstanding relationship with the Jewish community. He worked with Jews. He's friendly with Jews. He's philo-Semitic, but possibly could come in as a game changer. And there was a divide in the Jewish community about supporting Yang or Adams, and that's in 6 weeks. And I said, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's going to be a Democrat who wins. So whoever wins the primary has like over a 90% chance of going on to be mayor. But with the thing in Israel, Eric Adams sent out basically the same tweet Andrew Yang did, saying we stand with Israel, and Eric Adams has been doing that for a decade. But
Well, I hope
Andrew
he gets some
Yang
traction.
got pushed
Yeah, I
back.
think that Yang has actually had a lot of Jewish support. Maybe some of that might erode.
Well, I was
As
saying
we
he got put. He did. Just he sent out a normal kind of like U.S. politician. We stand with Israel, and he got pushed back because that's probably how a vast majority, even the Pew survey, said that 10% of American Jews support BDS. That means that like if statistically there are hundreds, and I know University of Michigan, there were a lot of Jews supporting BDS. Wayne State, like the local universities, but according to Pew, a full 10% of American Jews, support BDS.
That's
But so Andrew Yang had a little faltering there, and yeah, so it looks like Eric and various other reasons, so that I said Eric Adams was the most likely, just looking at the numbers and the demographics, the most likely person to become a mayor. Yang came out to a lead. His lead is diminishing, and it could be the faltering on Israel, especially if this is prolonged. That God forbid,
Yes,
the likelihood, like years ago, this lasted for like 40 days. If they do a ground campaign in Gaza, this is likely to go on. Maybe even 6 weeks from now, when the election, it could still be going on, and if Yang falters on that, Eric Adams has had a proven track record of working with the community for decades. So it was interesting you mentioned that last week, and I was saying Jews were favoring Yang, but now war in Israel and Yang faltering, that it looks the opposite.
All right, so Dooovid, listen, even though I'm live streaming on YouTube, I also am on Gab and BitChute and Minds and Rumble and all these other servers that I'm now on, including all these audio servers, but a lot of them won't take a full hour show. So I'm going to have to end it here. Let's pick up the thread next week. And
I read your book twice. Did you want to schedule for next week already to
anytime?
So do you want to pick a day and time?
Yeah, why don't we talk about that off the air? But thank you. But by the way, I should mention my new pamphlet. It's the 5th in my series of pamphlets. The Satanic Conspiracy is now available at Amazon. Thank you for
I read it twice now and looking forward. So have a great Sabbath, and we'll pray for peace, and
Israel,
somehow this de-escalates and things work out. And
exactly. May God protect the state of Israel, and may God protect America. And, I think that prayer has a lot to do with it. Anyway, thanks a lot, Dooovid.